Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Leonardo Bonanni. I'm the CEO, founder of Sourcemap, and I couldn't be happier to welcome you all here to the 2021, the first ever Supply Chain Transparency Conference. It's been a while coming, and supply chain transparency in general has come along a long way in the last 10 years or so. If you think back 10 years ago, you couldn't even Google supply chain transparency. It wasn't even a thing. And these days, I think just a couple of weeks ago, the White House had a conference on supply chain transparency. What's happened? A lot has happened in the last 10 years to bring us to this conference today. 10.5 years ago, a massive tsunami devastated the coast of Northeast Japan and sent global supply chains into a complete tailspin. And that's why a month later, I founded Sourcemap. It was a company that was meant to help manage the impacts of global trade through transparency, supply chain transparency. And a couple of years later, we moved here to New York, where you see me today, to an office that was reopened only after a massive storm flooded this entire neighborhood with about 5 meters of salt water. And of course, the last 2 years has been the most disruption we've ever seen in global supply chains as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And it really left no industry, no part of the world untouched for the first time ever. Obviously, these disruptions, time after time, underscore the need for more supply chain visibility. And you'd think that's the reason we're here today, but it's not. At least it's not the only reason. Long before the tsunami, some of the biggest companies in the world had already started making major commitments to source responsibly and to source transparently. Commitments to buy certified sustainable materials, commitments to end deforestation, to end forced labor, and commitments to disclose their supply chains to the public. And today and tomorrow, you're going to hear from these companies. And in parallel with these commitments from companies, governments around the world also started to put supply chain transparency into regulatory processes, processes like conflict minerals reporting and modern slavery laws, and supply chain mapping and due diligence for customs compliance. And today, you'll get to hear more about the rapidly evolving legal landscape that surrounds supply chain transparency. And then finally, supply chain transparency is here thanks to technology. Technology that makes it possible for a company to map and trace all of its products through thousands of suppliers, through hundreds of thousands of farms and mines and factories and warehouses. The cloud, the mobile internet that connect us from every corner of the globe, and incredibly powerful analytics that allow us to make sense of that data, the huge amount of data that we get through supply chain transparency. And you'll hear about those technologies and how companies are getting value out of that data tomorrow. Okay, I'm almost done. I'll just remind everybody, supply chain transparency isn't about transparency at all. It's about impact, right? It's about making sure that global trade can have a positive impact on everybody in the supply chain, from the first mile to the last. And transparency is what we need to enable the kind of collaboration on a global scale to make that impact happen. And that's why we're all here today. Over 1,000 of you registered for this conference to make collaboration possible for impact and to make transparency happen. It's going to be a great couple of days. Welcome again to the 2021 Supply Chain Transparency Conference. Let's get started. For our opening keynote, I'd like to introduce Luc Beerens, the Global Sourcing Director at Mars. Luc, take it from here.
Thank you, Leo. I had to unmute myself. No, thanks for the introduction. Taylor, if you can put on the first slide, please.
Yes, we'll do that now.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning and good afternoon all. As Leo said, I'm the I'm the Sustainable Sourcing Director for Mars. And what that means is that I'm supporting the procurement teams at Mars in integrating sustainability in our sourcing strategies and decisions. Today, I want to talk about why we care about sustainability before making the link to supply chain transparency and Sourcemap. And I will share 3 whys. The first one is climate change. So climate change, the UN, and I think most of us have seen that called Code Red a few weeks ago. We are already at 1 degree of warming, and we can all see the impacts of this through severe weather events, as Lee was mentioning. We are not heading into the right direction. We are heading for 3 to 4 degrees of warming instead of the 1.5. So we're not on track, and the future is uncertain. That's the first challenge our world is facing. The second one, deforestation. So an area the size of Scotland is being lost every year due to deforestation. So this accelerates climate change, but also has a massive impact on biodiversity. Third one is drought. So human activity, and especially agriculture, is draining the aquifers, and more rivers never reach the coast. There are disputes over water rights, and people and food supply is being displaced. Plastic, it's not getting any better, by the way. The studies show that there will be more plastic than fish in the sea by 2040. And for every meter of coastline, we will see 1 kilogram of plastic. And we don't even know what the impact of this will be on our food supply and on human health. Forced labor, or modern slavery, as some people call it. So millions of workers are paying to get a job, and they are working in often unacceptable conditions, also in our supply chains. Working for unacceptable conditions, extreme hours, and not even have the freedom to leave their job. Next one, women's rights. So too many women have little hope of education and are left without rights or left without paid work. And finally, I'm not cheering you up, am I? Child labor. So children are doing hazardous work and working instead of going to school. And that has, of course, a very harmful effect to their development and for the rest of their lives. So on all of these issues, we clearly have a moral responsibility to act. So the first why is for society. It's for all of us. It's for our kids, for our grandchildren, and beyond. The second why is because it makes good business sense. And let me talk about a few business reasons. Starting from the bottom left, it can save us money. We already see that in some cases where we have done good deals on buying renewable electricity through wind power or solar power at better rates than fossil fuel. But most of it we will see in the long term when companies with smaller carbon footprint and smaller plastic footprint will have to pay less taxes and less fees. The second reason is license to operate. There will be more and more scrutiny on the supply chains from which we source our materials. And how we are handling and how we are tackling issues. Could be deforestation, could be child labor, or any other of the issues that we saw previously. And we will soon be reaching a point where we need to prove that our goods and services that we buy are clean. Reputation. Working on sustainability and having sustainability issues in our supply chain can move our reputation up or down. We already see that for Mars. So our sustainability program and the progress that we are making has already boosted Mars' reputation. And it helps us in a variety of ways. And one of them is talent. People that are looking for jobs are getting more and more critical for the companies, to the companies that they want to work for. They expect companies to have a purpose. And working on sustainability is a very, very powerful proof point of having a purpose. And also our own associates. They feel very much engaged about the work that we're doing on sustainability. And that's one of the key reasons why they want to stay at Mars. And finally, growth. We know that consumers care more and more about sustainability. And some of them are prepared to change their purchasing decisions in favor of more sustainable brands. And all of us, or at least we, would like to see more of that. But that consumer demand will grow. It will grow for sure. So the second reason is business. The third why is working on sustainability is at the heart of the company that we want to be. So the Mars family, a few years ago, have aligned that they want to deliver 4 things together and not just growing and making profit. They believe that progressing on all of these 4 quadrants will help to deliver long-term performance. So these are the 3 whys. So where then to focus our efforts? Now, if we go to the next slide, clearly the biggest impact is in the raw materials or in the materials and the services that we buy, as this chart illustrates. Yes, there's work to be done at our own factories. There's also work to be done at our suppliers and the supplier production facilities. But most of the impact, social or environmental, is at the origin level, at the farms that we source from, the plantations that we source from. So supply chain transparency is key to understand, to identify, to acknowledge, and to address the risks that we have in our supply chains of the materials and the services that we buy. And we have wrestled for a number of years with spreadsheets and sending emails to our suppliers to understand better, where our materials are coming from. But we decided a few years ago that it's better to partner up with Sourcemap and put a robust supply chain transparency solution in place. And we are looking at delivering the following objectives. First of all, to understand the risks. And not only for us to understand the risks, but also to make that accessible to our suppliers. And those risks is a key input into our sourcing strategies. The second one is knowledge management. So too often information gets lost in personal files and folders. And when people move on to other jobs in our business, that information is often lost. So having this crucial information in one place is more than a great help. It creates efficiency, creates credibility, and it creates trust in our data. The last one is performance tracking. The Sourcemap tool helps us to see if we are on track in addressing the issues in our supply chain. It helps us to show the individual performance of our suppliers. And soon, our suppliers will be able to see their performance versus their competitors. And of course, we are looking forward to the new functionalities that Sourcemap is working on, and Leo and his team will share more in the next 2 days. And with that, I want to thank you and open it up for Q&A. Taylor.
Amazing. Thank you, Luc, so much. My name, just by means of quick introduction, is Taylor Ralph, and I'm a strategic accounts manager at Sourcemap. I've been working with the business for a number of years at this point, and a number of those years have been spent specifically with Luc, working to develop their programs at Mars. And so it's a pleasure to kind of zoom out here and participate in this conference in collaboration with you, Luc. So thank you so much for participating. We're going to open up a Q&A session for about the next 20 minutes we have time for. If we need more time, that's no problem. We have kind of some spillover time available if needed. And then the next session begins at 12:15, just for everyone's awareness. So there is a Q&A box in the Zoom. If you have any questions, please do drop them in there. We'll be moderating those throughout the process of the Q&A. And we have a couple of questions that have already been dropped in there. So we'll just go ahead and get started, Luc. And so one thing that you didn't mention, Luc, is just how long you've been working at Mars. I think you've had the distinct opportunity to watch a company like Mars that is so innovative change drastically over the course of that tenure. So I believe it's been almost 30 years, correct me on the number there, that you've been working at Mars in various roles, and was hoping that you could spend some time speaking to some of the ways in which the company has changed throughout that time, things that potentially have surprised you for the audience.
Yeah, I didn't want to tell my age, but you just did. But indeed, 28, almost 29 years with the company. I was a buyer myself for long. And yes, how did the company change? I think two things come to mind. One is, we always have been a very inclusive company. Didn't share a lot about, how our business was doing. It's a family-owned business, so we didn't have to. But the company has become, very, how do you say that? Less inclusive, and is reaching out to external stakeholders much more than what we ever have done before. And has the ambition to become very transparent in what we are doing, transparent in where our materials are coming from, and the issues that go with it, and the progress that we are making. Secondly, and that's maybe more of a recent change, is our purpose. For long, our business was about healthy growth and making profit. I'm very pleased with the new direction that Mars is taking, and the Mars family, the fourth and the fifth generation, had a big say in that. Is that they see the purpose of the company beyond that, and that delivering positive societal impact and being seen as a trusted partner, both internally and externally, are equally important deliverables in order to be successful in the long term. So I would call those out as the two biggest changes I've seen in those years.
That's great. And actually, it's relevant to a couple of follow-up questions that the audience is bringing. One, to your point about hoping to be more transparent. I think you're engaging partners and you're working more collaboratively with multiple stakeholders, but ultimately, can you speak to the goal of Mars to publicly disclose the information that you're collecting, even if it's a long-term public strategy with consumers and other stakeholders who may not be in those internal collaborative conversations?
Yeah, I think a good example is the our palm oil supply chain, and yes, and there were NGOs that helped to accelerate that disclosure. But we are very transparent in, and we have disclosed our palm supply chain, and actually also has led to a drastic change in the way we source our palm oil. We were sourcing palm oil from over 1,000 mills And with that amount of mills, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to manage all of the issues, deforestation and human rights. So we decided to drastically simplify that supply chain. And today we're sourcing from less than 100 mills with the ambition to reduce that to 50 in order to have a fighting chance to tackle the issues in the palm supply chain. And we're going to do that for other materials as well, and some moving faster than others.
And ultimately, is there an effort or an interest across the programs that you're managing currently to publicly disclose any of the information relative to those suppliers that you're working with, whether that's public-facing maps or public commitments? How do you engage with your consumers to talk about your progress?
Yeah, our plan to engage with consumers is to communicate through our brands, and that is not happening at the speed that we would like to. We think there is more opportunity for our brands to leverage the work that we are doing. That is gradually changing. So yeah, through our brands, we will communicate about the hero materials and the key materials that we source, and bring that to life through through maps and farmers and farmer families that we have in our supply chain.
Great, and then to that effect, in order to kind of disclose in a way that you'd like to at Mars, it requires collecting data that's of high quality. And so some of the audience members are asking, and this is of course a perennial question in this space, but how do you ensure that the data that you're receiving is of high quality?
Great question. Currently, it's a mixed bag. We are not always receiving the right quality of data. So that requires follow-up. So if suppliers are not able to identify where the materials are coming from, that is not where we stop. It means that the buyer will have to follow up with that supplier to be able to get more granular information, because that information is needed in order to assess the environmental and social risks, and then to take the appropriate action. And that action can be, indeed, switching suppliers. The action can be switching sourcing regions. In most cases, it is continuing to source where we source from, but together with our suppliers, with local implementers, NGOs, to set up programs that help to address that issue, be it social or environmental, and to truly make change to the issues in this world.
And alongside that theme of kind of theory of change over time and continuous improvement, I think you spoke briefly to the types of programs that you set up to facilitate suppliers to do their best work in accordance with the commitments that you've made as a company. Can you speak to how you incentivize suppliers to share information? I feel like Mars has put a unique amount of intention around working in collaboration with suppliers, but would just love to hear you speak more to that.
Yeah, good question again. We expect from our suppliers that they share their upstream supply chain with us. Again, not everybody is doing that. Not everybody is doing that with the right quality of data. Those suppliers that continuously not participate or continuously deliver bad quality data won't be the suppliers that we will continue working with. And that's becoming more and more clear. And that's what we communicate more and more clearly to our supplier base. We also, we do that not only on supply chain transparency, we also are doing that on climate action. We recently launched a program on climate action where we help our suppliers to set ambitious climate goals. Now, it's currently voluntary, but soon that will become more of a mandatory requirement. And those suppliers that hop on that train now will very likely be the suppliers that will benefit from more business.
And so another question just came in, and I know we've been speaking to this subject, but do you have any specific example of some of the incentives that you've provided to some of your suppliers, or maybe even down to the farmer level, to motivate them to invest in more sustainable practices?
The incentives in most cases is more business and continuation of business. Our business luckily is very healthy and it's growing. So volume as a result grows as well. And those suppliers that share our values and share our strategy, and together with us work on better supply chain transparency and together tackle the issues, will be suppliers that will get the volume that or the business that goes with our with us. With the growth that we are having as a business. On top of that, as said, there will be suppliers that won't make, and that will lead to more business for those suppliers that remain. And those are normally the biggest incentives. If you talk about farmers, that's a different story. To get farmers working on water saving or carbon reduction, that needs financial incentives like premium prices, technical support, cash advance, et cetera. So that's a different ballgame.
So I think also to speak to another relevant question is, part of the challenge, I think, from the supplier's perspective is that there are so many brands who are starting to pay attention to these types of issues, as well as international collaborations across nonprofit organizations. Are there any stories that you may be able to share, or philosophies surrounding pre-competitive partnerships that have been useful in incentivizing suppliers? Some suppliers struggle with needing to provide different pieces of information across various different brands. So that is something else that's come up in the audience.
Yeah, no, I think the most recent example is the coalition that we built end of last year on climate action, together with McCormick and PepsiCo, and Guidehouse, which is a consultant on climate action. So this is a coalition where we are engaged. Each of us is engaging our key suppliers to set climate targets. And we all come with the same ask, and we all offer the same support structure, which is free of charge to our suppliers, to guide them through that process of footprinting, target setting. And now that coalition has grown with new companies like Nestle, like Dr. Pepper, Burger King, Pizza Hut, etc. And the other obvious candidates like Unilever, Danone, and the retailers are being approached as we speak. So it's a good example, I think, of working in a pre-competitive environment with one ask to our suppliers.
Yeah, that's a great example. Can you repeat just for everyone the name of that coalition? Or that?
The coalition it's an ugly name, actually. It's called SLOCT, so it's Supplier Leadership on Climate Action. What I can do is share the link after my session, which you can share with the audience.
Amazing, thank you. Great, so moving through this list, great questions here. So thank you everyone who's participating and adding questions. I think a lot of those pre-competitive partnerships, international development collaborations tend to focus more broadly on really high volume commodities. So commodities that we're all familiar with that have big international supply chain issues like child labor, deforestation, cocoa, coffee, oil seeds, and so on. One of the audience members asked if you could speak a little bit more towards the Mars approach to agricultural commodities that are purchased in smaller volumes. So spices, fruits and vegetables, those that get less attention than palm oil or cocoa and other big commodities.
Yeah. So yeah, we also have been focusing on those materials where the biggest issues are, And those are the materials where we have high volume and are sourcing from regions with significant social and environmental issues like deforestation, child labor, income challenges. And then, yes, in our case, you're talking about palm oil, cocoa, sugar, also animal proteins. And the smaller ingredients, they are not being ignored, but we will, work on those when we are satisfied with the programs and the progress that we are making on the bigger ingredients, because that's where we can make the biggest difference. And also, this is where our business is, at risk. So it doesn't mean we're not going to work on the other ingredients, but it's currently not a priority.
Understood. So also relevant there is a question around how you benchmark suppliers. So for those suppliers that you are, or those commodities where you are doing data collection in large volumes with suppliers, how are you actually tracking the progress? Do you have some sort of scorecard? How do you organize the big risks, maybe categorically? And what are the tools that you use to support this benchmarking?
All right. Those are a few questions in one. Let's start with the risks. So we are using third-party risk assessments. So coming from WRI or from Maplecroft, and we customize it. That risk, those risk assessments are being visualized in Sourcemap through a map. So you see if a country or a region colors red or green, simple as that. And that's accessible or visible both to us, to our buyers, but also to our suppliers. So we all have one common understanding of, okay, this supply chain or this area, sourcing area, is at risk or not at risk for human rights issues, for income, for deforestation, for water stress. That's what we're doing on the risk side. On the scorecarding and the benchmarking, we have two key programs to address sustainability issues and to deliver performance improvement. One is focusing on the manufacturing facilities of our suppliers. The other one is focusing on the ultimate origin of where those suppliers are sourcing from. And we have, without going into too much detail, we have KPIs that then measure the progress that we're making at supplier level and at origin level. And at origin level, you can link that to the supplier. So each of the supplier has two scores. One of them is their performance in their own manufacturing facilities. The other one is their performance at how they are addressing the issues in their upstream supply chains, together with us and with NGOs and with local implementers, etc. And those two are being compared with their competitors for a certain category.
Great. Yeah. And I want to also just emphasize the point that you made at the beginning of that response, which is the importance of making sure that that is a transparent process with suppliers, in that you share with them the benchmarking that they've fallen into. They understand very clearly from their perspective what risk they're being assessed against. So would just want to emphasize that point. Another question from the audience, and I think we're still okay to continue. There is some spillover time, but just as a note of time, it is now 45 past the hour. So we have another 10 or 15 minutes to keep going through these questions.
Yet, right?
Not quite yet. There's a lot of engagement here, a lot of good questions. Kind of zooming out a little bit, or I guess you can get as specific as you think is necessary, but relative to those benchmarking tools, the way in which that you're communicating back with suppliers, how they're performing, and the process over time, as Mars has started doing this work with suppliers, what are some of the biggest insights that you've gotten over the years mapping your supply chain, and if any of those insights were particularly surprising?
I think for some materials, we already knew what the issues were, even before we started to use a supply chain transparency solution like Sourcemap. So for cocoa, we already, as an example, we were fully aware of the issues in the origins that we source from. But for other materials, which we now are bringing on the Sourcemap platform, we're getting more and more insights into where our materials are coming from, and insights that are very valuable because risks are surfacing that we weren't aware of. And we still have a long way to go. So there are materials that we still have to map and see what risks are there, and does that lead to a change in the way we source our materials? Can we continue the way we source our materials today? Or do we have to change certain suppliers, change sourcing areas, and often it's a combination of all of these, work with a selected group of suppliers to address the issues in the regions where we source from, which is the more meaningful route.
So a lot of questions here on assessment. I think all of us here understand that in order to make meaningful change and actually remediate any issues that we find in supply chain, we actually need to know what they are. And there are many ways of getting to that information. So we've talked about tools that you've used and leveraged to get this information from suppliers, ways in which you've collaborated with other brands. And then different benchmarking categorizational tools that you've applied and risk. Another comment or question from the audience is how you see existing certification schemes, so Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, and other, and to what extent you rely on these to assess your suppliers and your supply chain.
We have been focusing more on outcomes than on compliance. So certification is often not the strategic of the solution to tackle the issues that we see. We think more is needed than only a certificate. Having said that, and that's a bit of the challenge that we currently are facing, when it comes to consumer communication and claims, certification is a very powerful tool that satisfies, and in our case, our legal department to allow certain claims on our brands. So long story short, the combination of both verification/certification and intervention programs that truly deliver the change to environmental and social issues, I think is a powerful combination to have, because that will both deliver desired impact and will help us to communicate in a robust way through our brands what we are doing.
Great, thank you. Going to zoom out a little bit again with this next question and speak more to Mars's context. A question around how you help other internal stakeholders and company leadership understand the importance of investing in supply chain transparency, and to what extent this philosophy or culture is built into your business.
Yeah, so going back, it actually starts with the company purpose. So the 4 quadrants, which already show to everybody that positive societal impact is, and a trusted partner are as important as profit and growth. But in addition to that, I think what works is to translate sustainability issues into other deliverables like supply security, quality, long-term resilience of farmers. So if we work on sustainability issues, we do reduce supply risks. And that means we can keep our factories running and we can continue to sell our brands. That often resonates with a lot of internal stakeholders, in addition to doing good for people and planet. So translated into what sustainability delivers in addition to doing good for people and planet, what does it deliver for our business? And that often helps in creating alignment internally.
One other thing that I happen to have visibility into from conversations, Luc, is a comment that potentially in the future, Mars Inc. will be thinking about linking this type of social and environmental progress to internal incentives like pay. Is that something that you can share more information around? It seems radical. And I feel like, of course, that type of incentivization, linking this type of data to KPIs and performance, how did those conversations start at Mars, and kind of where are they now?
Yeah, I must admit that, you know, we are not the first company doing that. Several years ago, I heard, I think it was DSM, talking about having, you know, sustainability in the remuneration package of their senior leaders. We have been working on this for quite some time, and yes, that will now happen as of next year, starting with carbon. So the progress that we are making on reducing our carbon footprint will have an impact on the bonuses that our senior leaders are receiving, and that will also help in driving the sustainability agenda. And yeah, we're going to start with carbon, but also the other sustainability issues will or can be translated into KPIs that go into the remuneration packages of our senior leaders. And then we are walking the talk.
Thank you for sharing. That's really great. I'm going to go back to just a couple of questions that followed up on conversations we've been having. One is a question from the audience about industries or commodities that don't necessarily have alternative sources for their suppliers with good transparency. So one of the things that you shared is that should a supplier not necessarily be compliant with sharing the data that you're looking for, there is the alternative to select new suppliers. So if there's anything that you can share about that relative to alternatives.
Yeah. So if you are, you know, a single supplier, or if it is only one region where you get your material from, I think vanilla and Madagascar is a good example, then yes, you automatically move into a strategic relationship with your supplier. Now, in the case that strategic relationship is not balanced, and let's say the power, it's an ugly word, but it's too much at the supplier end, and the supplier doesn't want to, you know, work on sustainability issues or transparency, then the solution is to create a coalition and to make it, to have a stronger voice. You know, that's what we're doing on climate action now. So yeah, it's correct. You don't always have, you know, an option to change sourcing to other suppliers or to other regions. But this is where I think you first enter into, you know, a strategic relationship with that supplier. And if that doesn't help, call in the help of other off-takers.
Thank you. Another follow-up from our conversation about certifications, question from the audience on, do you think certifications will be replaced by norms such as the EU ISO norm on sustainable cocoa or the African ARS?
I'm gonna park that one.
That's no problem. No, that's no problem. It's an interesting question, very specific, but no problem at all. I guess at this point, so we have a few minutes left. There are no, I believe, other audience questions that I'm seeing. So if there are any kind of last words, Luc, that you want to share with this group and those who are participating today, potentially share a little bit about what's on the horizon for Mars. What do you see embedded into your sustainable sourcing strategy in the next 5 to 10 years?
Where I hope we will be in 5 to 10 years is that, you know, sustainability or sustainable sourcing is not a separate function or organization, but that sustainability is truly embedded in, you know, the hearts it's already in the hearts, but also in the minds and in the processes of our procurement teams. So same as what happened with quality years and years ago, sustainability automatically comes to mind when buyers are buying materials and services. And of course supported by subject matter experts on social or environmental issues. Secondly, I wish and hope that we have made quite a lot of progress on mobilizing our suppliers on climate action. We started this year, with the suppliers that we currently have engaged, we already have 25% of our carbon footprint covered. Now, that doesn't mean we reduced it by 25%, but if our suppliers follow through on their targets, we will have reduced our carbon footprint by 25% in a few decades. Now, I wish that will increase to 90% in 5 to 10 years. Not only because it helps us as a business, but I think this is truly needed in order to stop this planet from warming, and we all have to do a bit. Thirdly, is that we will be able to communicate in a very simple way with our consumers and through our brands, what we are doing, so that consumers can make conscious choice what brands they prefer to buy, and hopefully our brands will be recognized as a sustainable sourced product, and will have its existence on shelf and will still be bought by our consumers. So that's what I expect to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Ciao, Leo. Ciao, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon, I think, for someone, and good evening, maybe, for someone else. So, as agreed, Leo, I'm gonna share a few slides on what it means responsible sourcing for Ferrero, and then after that we will have some Q&A. I'm gonna share my screen. You tell me, guys, if it is okay, if it is online.
Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. So when we speak of responsible sourcing for Ferrero, the strategy that we set up around, probably now it's 2 years ago, it's quite straightforward. We do 4 things. We we call it 4 steps approach. We do 4 things. We start with the due diligence, all our suppliers, and our due diligence is for all categories, from raw materials to general procurement, no exception. All our suppliers need to undergo our due diligence. That, of course, it's gonna have different nuances depending on the level of risk and the level of the type of category. Then we have a layer that we call supply chain visibility. That means having literally mapping our origin, mapping our sources, especially this applies mainly for all our raw materials. We have an additional layer that is standards and certifications, because it's key for us to, for our most important raw materials, to have a minimum standards and certification in terms of sustainability. And when we deem that all these steps are not enough, we add our remediation or mitigation programs, which are direct investments that we do only on our supply chains. And clearly, as you see from the graphic here, is the logic is the higher is the risk in the commodity, the more we add layers. And of course, with the logic that we start with a common basis for all the suppliers, that is, as I said at the beginning, that is the due diligence, and it clearly covers the whole portfolio of vendors of Ferrero. And if you think of it, it's quite simple. Basically, we start with the first layer, that means know your suppliers. Second point is know your supply chain, know and map your supply chain. Third point is know how your supply chain works and steer how your supply chain works. And fourth point is support your supply chain. So this is our strategy. This is how we are working, and what I'm going to show you in the next 4 slides is basically an extract of what we do for each of these streams. So supplier risk management or due diligence, it's a very hot topic. And why we do it, I mean, the food industry is changing the way it's approaching this topic. And there are clearly 3 drivers that are pushing us in this direction. Of course, consumers asking us where we source our ingredients. They ask us how we source. And more and more retailers are also going obviously in the same direction. And they're asking us basically exactly as we do with our supplier. We are their suppliers. They're asking us to have a minimum level of sustainability rules in the way we manufacture and we source. And of course, even more important, the regulation. Regulation is coming out in Europe, a global, let's say, a European regulation on the due diligence. But in some other countries, they have their own regulation, maybe on some specific part that is not that could be on human rights. US has the CBP has its own, let's say, reasonable care practice and rules on how we should source. So the regulation is also pushing the industry in having a due diligence structure and system and process in place. So basically, know your supplier is for sure it's gonna be mandatory in the future. And what it means due diligence, it's quite simple. It means knowing where are the risks, basically knowing where are the risks and having a strategy in place to mitigate these risks. Next step is what we call in Ferrero supply chain visibility. That, as I said at the beginning, is know and map your supply chain. Basically, here two examples of the platforms which we use to for supply chain visibility. Clearly, we use Sourcemap. Here it's an example for cocoa, but we are deploying Sourcemap also with our hazelnut suppliers, and we have a plan to slowly involve most of our key commodities on the Sourcemap platform, and this is for us to build the minimum level of visibility for our raw materials. And when we deem this, again, this is not enough. We go even beyond, where we have more information. That, for example, where we are more advanced, like in palm oil, we use Starlin, which is a satellite monitoring, leveraging Airbus infrastructure. And today we are at the level that we monitor 100% of our plantation in palm oil through Starlin. And we have a process for which we review every month. We review the alerts and we understand if there are changes undergoing in our plantations. And this is where we are on the supply chain visibility. when it goes to standards and certifications, we leverage a broad range of certifications, and also in some cases we even go to company standards. We go to company standards when we believe that the certification in place in this specific category, it's not enough or it's not deployed enough. For example, in the hazelnut, there are no significant standards. We thought, and this is a let's say historical choice of the group already back many years ago, to develop our own standard, sourcing standard. We called it Ferrero farming values, and it is applied on hazelnuts. But when we think that the standard and the sector has already deployed a robust and relevant standard, we clearly leverage that. This is, everybody knows, Ferrero is 100% RSPO. We are 100% even segregated. We use broadly use certification of rainforest and fair trade. For example, for cocoa, we use Bonsucro for cane sugar. So our strategy is quite simple. So if there are significant standards that are recognized by the sector, we clearly leverage that, like our competitors. If in the sector we don't see this standard deployed or robust enough, we develop our own. And going to the last point is, what do we do in terms of mitigation programs? So we cannot do it on all the commodities, but there's a clear choice based on the commodities that are more relevant for us and where we think more support needs to be provided to the supply chain. In the first case that you see is Save the Children. We started a pilot some years ago, I think it was in 2017, on few communities in Ivory Coast. It was quite successful. After that, we really decided to significantly invest, and we signed a program, a 5-year program, on to cover 65 communities in Ivory Coast where we source, which is probably one of the key areas in one of the key regions of Ivory Coast where we have most of our supply chains and most of our farmers. And the idea is in 10 years to basically fully cover all our, with the same program, with an extension with following 5 years to cover all the whole cocoa supply chain with Save the Children program. And this is a very ambitious program, but we deem this was a direct intervention that was necessary to have a minimum standard where we source. And we've done something very similar, clearly in a different context, with ILO in Turkey. This has a duration, this program has a duration of 3 years. And basically, together with our different engagement with ILO, in some cases together with the sector, and in some cases directly only us with ILO, we cover 7 regions of Turkey with the ILO programs to clearly combat child labor and ensure especially during the harvest season, to have educational programs where to enroll children, especially children of migrant workers. And we are very proud of this, because today we basically cover all the regions where Ferrero is sourcing in Turkey with this program, making sure we can never be sure, but clearly giving a strong signal, I think, to the market, and that we really believe we need to improve the situation, and this I think is starting to provide also some significant results. And Leo, I think this is it regarding my, let's say, overview of what we do in Ferrero, and I'm happy to have a Q&A. Feel free to shoot out questions.
Great, thank you, Nicola. So when you put in place a program where every supplier goes through due diligence, you map all the origins for your key commodities, how do you get buy-in from the suppliers, from the supply chain, to participate in this?
Well, this is clearly, in principle, I would say everybody is always happy to adhere to this kind of programs. Then the devil's in the details, and you probably know better than me that the problem is rolling out and deploying is much more complex. And so how do we do? The way we do it is, first of all, we ask all our suppliers to acknowledge and sign our supplier code. Our supplier code is requesting to have a minimum level of transparency with us, with Ferrero. So this is our starting point. So it starts there. And of course, we first of all start compliance and engaging, because in some cases suppliers don't even, they also have doubts in signing or acknowledging our supplier code. Maybe the discussion starts already there. Discussion starts already there with such suppliers that are how to say, have concerns in sharing data. And then most of the time, what we try to do is to understand what are the issues, what are the problems. And I have to say that in Ferrero take this very seriously. And in the case of suppliers that today are not willing to come along in this journey, well, unfortunately, we cannot have them working with us. And this is sometimes the choice we are doing.
Yeah, no transparency is the biggest risk.
Yeah.
What about internally inside the company? How do you have to get the buy-in internally? Do you have to prove return on investment for this level of transparency?
I have to say that, of course, also internally, you need to make education. There's one thing that is clear today, that is transparency is necessary in order to, as a license to operate, a license to grow. It's a protection, what we call it's a shield. So everything that we do in due diligence, everything that we do in traceability today is what we call it a clear shield. It's for us to be able to how to say, to explain to the world what we are doing. But I think in what is happening more and more, especially in the engagement that I have with the marketing teams, is how this could be conveyed also to the consumer, because today is mainly let's say the audience that is more interested in this part is the institutions, organizations, different associations, NGOs. We are probably, what we're going to see in the future is starting to communicate this also to consumers. And this, of course, will make the return on transparency, even the business case, I think, clearer.
That's what I was going to ask too. Is there, as you mentioned, consumers, you mentioned retailers, you mentioned regulators, and we're always keen to see how people are going to message, and I know Ferrero's been messaging quite a lot about its sustainability activities publicly. Is there a plan to even have any kind of traceability available to consumers?
I think it's a good question. I think probably the right answer. We are exploring this. We are at the beginning of an exploration of this topic.
With these sort of enormous supply chains that you have to trace, to get visibility on, to manage the risks, you've also been at the forefront of adopting these new technologies. You talked about the satellites. Obviously, we're working together. Where do you see this going? What do you think of as the future for supply chain transparency, for the initiatives that you're exploring?
But look, the future of transparency in supply chain, I think, is directly connected to the future of technology, the future of digitalization. But you cannot have one without the other. So the challenge clearly is that doing this in the agri-value chain is more complex. Then if you do it as often we do, and you know better than me, in some developing countries, it becomes even more complex because there's a problem of infrastructure. There are several problems. So it is very complex. But the way I see it is that sustainability agenda, in this case, will go along with the agenda of technology and digitalization. And what I see in the future is that when you get to full digitalization of some supply chains, you'll get directly to full sustainability, basically. The way I see it is digitalization equal to transparency, equal to sustainability. It will almost become, how to say, immediate, like a direct consequence.
I'm right there with you. If we do our job right, transparency will be automatic. We're getting questions about how to use these kinds of technologies, use these kinds of due diligence approaches to verify, the practices on the ground and to verify the claims that you make publicly. I assume that's a big part of why you're turning to data to trace the supply chain.
Well, yes, because the way we are today, the way we are working today is as much as possible to back up the claims. So I would say, I would turn it around. We don't do the claims if first we don't have the data. So this is probably, if you see at the world of sustainability or the landscape of sustainability in the last 10 years, probably between 2010 to probably 2020, there were a lot of claims. Many of them companies were not able to achieve. Of course, probably I'm sure in good faith, but this has proven that without data, you cannot go any more out claiming something. And in this regard, as Ferrero, we've never been extremely vocal because it's part of our DNA. And I have to say that we probably started recently to be a little bit more vocal, but there's not a single claim that comes out if we are not 100% sure that we are extremely confident to hit it. So claim without data, it's something of the past. In the future, I think that again, I think there's a total equivalence.
That's a great way to close it. So great data, great claims, and great transparency. Thank you, Nicola.
You're very welcome, Leo. Thank you very much.
Everybody, hi, I'm Leonardo Bonanni. I'm the CEO of Sourcemap, and I'm here for our next session with John Foote, who is an attorney specializing in customs compliance at Kelley Drye And we're going to spend the next hour getting as much familiarity as we can with the new landscape of customs compliance involving the supply chain, and specifically Section 307 of the forced labor enforcement actions that we've seen so frequently in the news these days. And so welcome, John.
Thanks, Leo. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. I know people are going to be taking notes furiously during this session. So let's start at the beginning, because we have a lot of various industries represented today, and we have a lot of various countries and continents on the attending the conference. So what is, in a nutshell, what is Section 307?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the U.S. has had this law going back to 1930, and there are actually predecessor versions going back to the late 1800s. And it's a prohibition on importing anything into the United States that was made wholly or in part with forced labor. For much of the history of this law, there was an exception, a loophole in the provision of the bill that said that if goods were not made in the United States in enough quantities to satisfy domestic consumption, that the import ban did not apply. In other words, if you're importing something because there is a gap in the U.S. market, the ban did not apply. So it was an exception that sort of swallowed the rule. So fast forward to 2016, Congress removed that loophole from the bill, from the legislation, and what was left is a blanket ban on importing anything into the United States that is made wholly or in part with forced labor. So over the last 5 years, we've seen significant growth in utilization as Customs has begun to wield this tool against allegations of forced labor in different circumstances and contexts around the globe, but that's sort of the general history of the import ban.
There we go. Does the ban have any similarity to laws that are already on the books? I'm thinking the one in France, the vigilance law, and the UK modern slavery legislation.
Yeah, great question. So what's interesting about 307 is that it is a trade-specific law, and it really is about prohibiting the movement of physical goods across international borders, particularly the US border, when those goods have been made wholly or in part with forced labor. So there are several different legal regimes globally that have touched on sustainability issues, human rights issues, human rights and supply chain issues. The French duty of vigilance law obligates companies within the scope of that law to conduct a certain amount of due diligence with respect to their supply chain. Sort of the model that prevailed in a lot of jurisdictions before that was the Modern Slavery Act model, and the Modern Slavery Act is predicated on the notion of supply chain transparency, right? Obligating companies to make a disclosure about how they mitigate against the risk of forced labor or other adverse supply chain impacts, and that's also modeled after the California supply chain bill. This is a totally different genre of law, if I can use that phrase, because it's really focused on actually stopping the movement of goods that are bound in international transit. And really, it's the only law of its kind, although there have been sort of recent adoptions by other jurisdictions of similar laws sort of in principle. The US is the only jurisdiction that's actively enforcing its forced labor import ban really at this time.
Okay, so whereas the other legislation seems to be more about implementing business processes to map the supply chain, to obtain transparency, to do due diligence on the suppliers, this is the only one that's enforceable through an actual seizure of goods.
Yeah, that's right. So if your goods are named within it, so and I think that tees up a really an important point, which is sort of how does this get enforced? And the answer is Customs takes enforcement actions, and Customs has the ability to issue what they call a withhold release order, also referred to as a WRO. And a withhold release order identifies some category of merchandise that Customs has reason to believe might be affected by forced labor. It might be tainted by forced labor. Customs will then detain shipments that contain the category of merchandise that's identified in a WRO at a border, and an importer is given the opportunity to either prove that the shipment coming in doesn't contain that category of merchandise, or it does contain the category that's specified in the order, but it wasn't made with forced labor, and actually able to put on proof about the condition of labor that was utilized in the supply chain to make the goods. So you're right. That is what is distinct about 307, is that it is a, well, what can you prove type of law, right? As opposed to conduct due diligence, take responsible, practices, tell the public about, tell your consumers about what you're doing. This is a proof-driven legal regime.
So if it's a burden of the company to prove that the shipment was made without forced labor anywhere along the supply chain, we'll get to that. But what does customs need to justify a WRO?
Yeah, so it's a relatively low threshold for the imposition of a WRO, and the entire process is treated as by U.S. Customs as a law enforcement process, which means that there's no sort of transparency to the process by which Customs will consider and decide and then eventually choose to impose a WRO. So sometimes, an NGO or a third-party group might petition for a WRO, and sometimes those groups have an interest in making their allegations or their petitions public. So we have gotten a glimpse at what sort of the type of allegation is that can give rise to a WRO, but the process for implementing it is entirely internal to Customs, and it's a relatively low threshold. It's evidence which reasonably indicates the presence of forced labor in the designated commodity. And the way Customs is looking at this is based on the interpretation of the statutory language, which says wholly or in part made with forced labor. They are considering whether a finished good contains, was itself made with forced labor, contains components that were made with forced labor, contains raw materials that may have been grown or harvested or produced with forced labor. So, it's the full kaleidoscope of the visibility of supply chain is sort of distilled into, Customs lens and its ability to focus at the border.
Okay, so it's a relatively opaque process, and the seizure can happen, and then it's a burden of the importer to demonstrate that the seizure was made in error. Is there any is this happening to a lot of people? Is it happening to a lot of industries? How widespread are these seizures today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, as I mentioned, we're sort of entered the modern era of enforcement beginning in like 2016. 2 years ago, the total value of goods detained by U.S. Customs pursuant to Section 307 was about $200,000 US dollars. In 2019, that had jumped to $1 million. Last year, Customs detained $50 million of shipments pursuant to its enforcement of WROs. And this year, it sort of has broken sort of gone off the charts. Customs is currently detaining between like $60 and $90 million a month, which puts it on pace to detain about 600 million to a little over $1 billion over the course of the next year. So this has gone from sort of being completely not on the radar screen of most companies to a really considerable impact on the overall importation of the United States.
Let's talk about the impact across industries. So a lot of attention in the press goes to the region-wide ban on certain products from Xinjiang. Is this limited to that?
So we don't have a lot of visibility into the trade enforcement statistics. There have been statements made by customs officials with responsibility for overseeing this, who have suggested that as many as 3/4 of the value of the overall detentions relate to the cotton order targeting cotton from Xinjiang in particular. And that sort of tracks with what I'm hearing from clients as well, is about 75% of the detention pace. So maybe $750 million a year right now is being detained on that pace pursuant to the cotton order alone.
Okay, So heavily focused, I'm guessing, in a way that will impact the apparel and housewares industry. What about the other 25%? Are we seeing any pattern there?
So customs has basically taken two different types of enforcement actions. I just, they're WROs, but there have basically been two different categories of WROs that have been issued to date. There are WROs that target specific individual economic actors. So these are, company-specific WROs. The historic utilization of 307 WROs were issued primarily in instances of alleged prison labor by a finished manufacturer of goods. And there are a number of WROs dating back, decades, which are still theoretically in effect today, even if those, entities are now defunct. But some of the more noteworthy WROs within the last year or two have been targeting large, significant players, for example, in the palm industry, significant entities that are, real business concerns that aren't just going to disappear overnight because an order was issued against them and the company's just going to go away. These are real companies with, significant business portfolios. The other model is of a WRO is targeting a commodity from a jurisdiction like cotton from Xinjiang or cotton from Turkmenistan or gold from Malawi. There are a few different commodity country product or combinations that have been targeted by WROs.
Okay, so there's a global reach, even though the majority of the enforcements have been focused on Xinjiang. And if you're seeing the kind of exponential growth that we've seen in the value of detentions in the last year, where's the next year headed? What patterns can you tease out?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Customs has, Customs, because this is such a priority on the Hill, on Capitol Hill and in DC, there have been efforts to allocate funding specifically for forced labor enforcement. And so for the fiscal year that just ended 2 weeks ago, there was a specific allocation of funding that went to the forced labor enforcement. And in response to that allocation, Customs made public statements just a couple of weeks ago that they were standing up a second investigations branch. So now they've got 2 investigations branches. And this second investigations branch, it wasn't totally clear whether it's going to be fully geographically oriented elsewhere, but the customs official in charge of the forced labor division said to anticipate enforcement actions targeting goods from Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So not just Asian jurisdictions. So we do anticipate that there will be additional action against either companies or commodities from each of those additional regions.
Okay, so a huge expansion in coverage and new funding for enforcement. Okay, so let's get to brass tacks. If a company experiences or thinks they might be subject to a WRO, what should they start doing?
Yeah, well, so I guess maybe it's worth sort of acknowledging the reality that different WROs, while it is a common sort of single, pretty blunt instrument that Customs is wielding here, different WROs impact businesses in radically different ways. And that's both when you're talking about the difference between a commodity-specific WRO versus a company-specific WRO. If you are an importing business that is importing into the United States and a company that's in your supply chain is named in a company-specific WRO, I think most importers have sort of an immediate assessment associated with how consequential is this supplier, how important is this supplier. If they are not a consequential or not a significant supplier, the easiest solution is to source from a different supplier. If they are a large player or a significant supplier in your supply chain, that's not always easy to do. And you have to sort of take additional steps at that point to figure out what type of evidence you can marshal with respect to goods from that company or goods that originated with that company. If you're talking about navigating a commodity, even here, there are potentially very significant differences in the type of response that a company might take. So, for example, with the order against cotton from Xinjiang, there has basically been as far as I can tell, no appetite among anyone in the government or in the private sector to try and distinguish between types of cotton harvest within Xinjiang. Quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of appetite to distinguish between Xinjiang origin cotton and China origin cotton more broadly. And as a result, the natural response to that order is to try and avoid or to eliminate that category of cotton, that designation of cotton, from your supply chain entirely. It becomes a lot different if you talk about, a potential commodity order being imposed against a product for which there is only maybe 1 or 2 or 3 significant producers globally, where a commodity, WRO targeting a particular, type of agricultural product from a jurisdiction that doesn't have available alternative sources of supply. In that instance, there are going to be a lot of companies that continue to be dependent upon that country and that source of supply. And there's going to have to begin to be the process of a distinction and a delineation between the types of flows, the types of commodities that are moving through your supply chain that are considered, low risk and high risk, that are considered clean and tainted, if you will.
So, I mean, in a sense, the assessing of the risk, it sounds like that's a no-brainer. Everybody has to start with that. Does customs care if there was negligence, intent? Does any of that matter to their ultimate judgment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is customs does care about importers exercising sort of a basic standard of due care when it comes to their supply chain. Within the U.S. customs universe, there is this concept of reasonable care, and all importers are supposed to exercise reasonable care in the context of everything they do from a trade standpoint, from classifying their goods, figuring out how much stuff is valued, all the aspects associated with filing a customs declaration and entry with U.S. Customs to bring goods into the country. That extends to and includes efforts to ensure that there is no forced labor present within a supply chain. What is not true, though, it's not the case that simply by exercising reasonable care, you're going to guarantee that you're outside the cone of enforcement. At the end of the day, if you have a shipment that gets detained, it becomes a proof question. It becomes, what sort of proof can you marshal? If you've exercised reasonable care and you've got general sort of due diligence controls and whatnot in place designed to mitigate the risk of forced labor in your supply chain, great. You probably remove yourself from the cone of danger when it comes to issuance of a penalty. But if your objective is to preserve your ability to continue to keep this channel of trade open and bringing goods into the United States, we're talking about more than just reasonable care or basic sort of due diligence. It really comes down to a question of what can you prove about goods that are moving into the country. It's a proof-based regime. And it's novel. I mean, there's like nothing sort of like it. So there's definitely a learning curve for a lot of companies to begin thinking from that question. Even companies that really have their arms around, risk mitigation for forced labor within their supply chain generally. If you ask the question, suppose we have container number on the water on its way into the United States, how are you going to prove the absence of forced labor wholly or in part throughout the supply chain for the production of these individual items in this individual container? That's a tough question. And it is a question that presumes a level of knowledge about your supply chain that, if we're honest, a lot of companies don't have, right? A lot of companies don't have visibility. They don't have knowledge about the supply chain. They just don't know. And that's why I've enjoyed our conversations and our dialogue, because I think you're offering essentially a critical service. Like without knowing who the actors are in your supply chain, going back to origin, you're not even in a position to begin to answer a proof question that is specific to individual goods that might be coming to the U.S. in a container.
Well, I'm right there with you. So let's go even deeper. So a risk assessment, obviously, anything you can do to anticipate and avoid working in regions or commodities in regions or with actors that have been identified as being high risk will save you a lot of heartache down the road. Assuming that, like most companies, you have the supply chain you have today, and any changes you're going to make to that supply chain are going to take months, maybe years. What are the, and I know this is something you specialize in, which is helping a company put in place that sort of documentation process that could prepare it for any kind of, it could be a questionnaire from Customs and Border Protection, could be a WRO. Can you talk a little bit more about the kinds of documentation, the kinds of systems that companies need to think about putting in place?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think the first question that any company that wants to sort of take the 307 threat seriously, the first question that you begin with is, what WRO would be problematic for me if it was issued tomorrow? What type of order, right? Is there a supplier within our supply chain who is critical, large volume, irreplaceable? Is there a commodity that we are dependent on from a jurisdiction that is critical, that is irreplaceable? Or is there just a commodity from a jurisdiction that we're highly dependent on? And there are, of course, many different ways, many different screening mechanisms that you can utilize to, triage your supply chain and come up with a sort of a short list of your worst case scenario. There was a time a couple of years ago when I was talking with a few clients who were particularly forward thinking. We asked this question, and the answer was, well, I think an order targeting cotton from China would be like the worst thing I could imagine. And at that time, when Customs was detaining $200,000 of shipments per year, it seemed like pretty far-fetched. I think a lot of people did not anticipate that Customs would actually pull the trigger on that, thinking that perhaps even just issuing that type of a WRO would sort of break the system. What we saw was that Customs did have the courage to take that step, sort of the political courage to take that step. The way they did it was basically by slowly on-ramping the actual detention process. So that WRO hit on day one. They did not immediately start detaining, the $10 billion of annual shipments that may be alleged to contain Xinjiang origin cotton overnight. It's been a slow on-ramp, but they're obviously picking up to a really considerable pace. So I think step one for a company is, what WRO would give us a problem, right? And then the second question is, well, what type of proof would Customs want to see with respect to individual shipments to navigate? And then so what type of proof? Customs thinks of the world in terms of, from a supply chain standpoint, they think of it in terms of sort of a pyramid. I like to use the analogy of like a family tree, right? Like, right, you've got, sort of direct suppliers, and your direct suppliers have their direct suppliers, and so on and so forth, going up to your great grandparents and beyond. And at some point you get to sort of like the creation of humanity. And mapping your supply chain is basically about like doing the basic genealogical research to identify who are the actors who are responsible for my existence, right? Or for the existence of the goods that are coming into the country. Customs thinks about the world in transactional terms, in terms of, if they are going to target a commodity deep in a supply chain, something that your great-great-grandparent may or may not have done, right? You have to know who your great-great-grandparent is before you can start making evaluations or assessments about whether they did or did not do the problematic act in question. So step one is, what WRO do I fear? Step two is, what do I know about my supply chain, about the actors within my supply chain? And then Customs is thinking about it on a transactional basis. And ultimately, if they are stopping a shipment based on the action of that one great-great-grandfather who procured Xinjiang origin cotton, what you would want to be able to do is to produce a document trail that would establish the provenance of the cotton fiber that was purchased by that great-great-grandfather, and showing that it isn't Xinjiang origin. Now, there are other types of technologies that could potentially be leveraged here, but sort of at a base level, like if you ask, what is Customs looking for when they get a detention? The regulations, the Customs laws say you got to get a certificate of origin from your supplier. And then you got to show us additional proof, whatever additional proof is needed to show that this problematic class of labor wasn't used. So the certification is it's very straightforward. It's a sign on the dotted line kind of certification from your supplier. But then it's the other proof that no forced labor was utilized, which is sort of this huge open-ended question. And I would say generally customs is looking for sort of transactional documentation that is then augmented by sort of all the rest of what sustainability operations in major companies are up to these days with respect to forced labor mitigation. And then potentially augmented by some sort of technological component to that. There's a lot of interest in that. So kind of a long-winded answer, very long-winded answer, but.
So no, but it's a long-winded problem. So understanding where the WROs are going to hit you the most, determining the criticality of the suppliers you need to focus on, and then pulling all the documents together. And I can only imagine. Well, I know different industries, different commodities, completely different types of documentation to show that these standards are being upheld. Speaking of different commodities, a lot of the speakers at this conference, believe in various certifications and standards when they source some of the raw materials that are coming from around the world that we rely on every day. In your opinion, these standards, and I'm thinking. Fair trade, rainforest, RSPO, these types of commodity-specific standards and certifications, which are often accompanied by audits, do they weigh in on this documentation?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I would say that for people who live and inhabit and breathe the air of the sustainability world, you got to flip through the Rolodex of all your certifications and think through, okay, which of these are related specifically to labor issues and specifically to forced labor, right? So there are lots of certifications that carry a lot of street cred, if I can say that, in a lot of environments that are just not relevant at all to the question of labor, forced labor. So for those that are, you pull those out of the Rolodex, and okay, so we've got a couple of different certifications. There are, of course, different models for certification, and one of the questions that I would say has not really decisively been answered by customs in any sort of public forum that I'm aware of is how customs treats systems for certifying that rely on the disaggregation of or disidentification of individual molecules or beans or pods of a particular product. So there are certification schemes that do it on a mass balance basis, right? Where a certain amount goes in, a certain amount comes out, and on a mass balance basis, the certifier says, we're keeping track of the columns and we're willing to certify a certain amount. For better or for worse, the 307 regime is really very much commodity specific. It's about those individual items that are coming in or the molecules that were baked into the loaves of bread that are coming in. It's very commodity specific, and it is not yet clear sort of how customs is going to handle that. But there is a clear affinity, I would say, from customs standpoint for defined chains of control, defined channels of supply, where possession is sort of documented and established, and the labor condition such that it is of a particular batch of goods is certified, is understood, is known, and is then traced throughout the supply chain. In other words, mass balancing might be perfectly acceptable within your certification regime. It is probably going to have a little bit of a different mileage when it comes to US customs. Because if your certification is predicated on a mass balance, there's still a question from customs standpoint of, should I allow this shipment of goods to come in? Does this constitute sufficient evidence that forced labor was not used on these goods, on these individual commodities that are coming in my, through my container? So yeah, mixed mileage, but absolutely it has to be the starting place. And I would say that if I was putting on my, pulling out my crystal ball here, I would say that what I predict that in response to increasing enforcement by customs, there's going to be a push in the direction of direct identification through channels of supply. There's going to be a push in that direction. How much of a push or how far we'll get sort of remains to be seen, but I would say that mass balance based structure and regime, sort of like generalized risk mitigation, which is totally effective and appropriate in the context of a due diligence regime like a French duty of care law or a possible EU human rights due diligence. Mitigate your risk, document it, write up a report, show that you've reduced your risk. Like that's considered like enough. From a trade enforcement standpoint, it's more focused on what can you prove about the container that's coming in the water right now.
So moving from a sample-based or a mass balance-based approach to certifications to traceability, but keeping those certifications going, especially those that have standards and audits that directly deal with labor issues. Yeah,
that's right. And I would just say, there is no one right way to solve any of these problems, and the existing sort of certification regimes, right? Like they grew up in a world like pre-307, right? Pre-Section 307, where what really mattered was a brand's ability to communicate to a consumer, like we're trustworthy, right? We're keeping track, we're paying additional money, we're doing the best we can, but look, these things lose identity at moment one in the supply chain. In a world where there is an active enforcement regime that is focused on direct identification, I think the certification world is going to sort of catch up to that eventually. But there are some growing pains, and there are other ways too beyond sort of direct identification or sort of labor-intensive mechanisms. There are different ways to deploy, different types of technological tools, and everybody has like their favorite sort of idea or their favorite sort of project. But in terms of, well, we could do a forensic testing, or we could do a DNA testing, or we could, create some DNA and then we could apply it to the product and we can ship it through the supply chain and then we can measure. I mean, there's all kinds of really innovative and interesting strategies. What you need to be focused on is what's going to resonate and what's going to be, salient from a U.S. Customs enforcement standpoint, because they are the ultimate audience with respect to this type of enforcement, and they've got a certain view and a certain way of looking at the world and looking at supply chains, because that is part of the remit of the agency.
I'm getting some questions from the audience, but I think building on what we were just talking about. So, in the absence of certifications that are applicable to this particular CBP enforcement of the forced labor ban, are there audits that are audits enough? Are audits the recommended sort of best practice to deal with labor issues in the supply chain?
Yeah, so audits are. I mean, I think we all know that audits are sort of a mixed bag, right? I mean, they're a necessary evil, or an evil good, or a necessary good that's got some flaws with it. It is essential. It is essential if a company wants to take responsibility for the conditions of labor in manufacturing operations throughout a supply chain, to have some sort of mechanism by which a third party comes in and evaluates what's going on. So they are necessary in that sense. I think there's a lot of people that level a lot of different types of critiques against them. They are very cumbersome. They're very difficult. They're very burdensome on suppliers. They are, debatable in terms of their effectiveness. But I mean, you got to do something. So they're an essential component, and certainly not one to be overlooked. If you're living in a world where there is a customs WRO targeting a commodity deep at the base of the supply chain, like no volume of audit activity on intermediaries within that supply chain, let's just say you've traced beyond tier 1. Let's say you've traced to tier 2. Let's say you've traced to tier 3. Let's say you're auditing tier 1, 2, and 3 in your supply chain, right, on a regular basis. Let's say you're putting in significant resources. That may be no evidence whatsoever of the presence or absence of what is deemed to be a problematic commodity deep in your supply chain. So they're an essential component. And if you're bringing an answer, so let me just say, by the same token, in enforcement, in responding to enforcement, I have heard anecdotally, and I haven't actually had any direct experience of this, but I've heard anecdotally that upon being presented with evidence that the commodity in question is not present in the supply chain, that sometimes customs has come back and asked, well, what about forced labor in the rest of the supply chain? Now, I have a little bit of a problem, and by little, I mean a big problem with that from a legal standpoint, because I don't think that's really justifiable under the law at all. But that highlights sort of another point, which is that for many companies, they feel like they are operating at a distinct disadvantage vis-a-vis customs, because there is sort of there's a stigma associated with being affiliated with even an accusation of forced labor, right? This is a highly sensitive topic, super brand sensitive for most companies. So coming back in answer to a question from customs with, I'm sorry, the law doesn't authorize you to be policing that, like that, there's usually like less appetite for that than I think there should be, because I think the basis for the law here is like, for how it is being wielded in certain instances is a little bit weak. But that said, if you are able to prove the absence of the problematic commodity, and then customs comes back to you and says, yeah, well, what about forced labor throughout the supply chain? What evidence do you have of that? Well, you better have a robust audit program in place, and you certainly want to leverage that. So the answer is, it's so diverse, and everyone's mileage is different. Everyone's experience is different. Everyone's supply chain is different. Everyone's economic weight vis-a-vis their supply chain is different, right? There are small companies importing into the United States that have no weight, or they have no ability to move the needle with regards to their suppliers. So they're really dependent on their suppliers being cooperative and just producing information that is needed. When you bring a response to customs, you want to bring everything, because ultimately it does end up becoming a bit of a reputation game, right? And they need to understand that you are serious, you're taking the problem seriously, you're taking the issue seriously, you're taking their enforcement seriously, and you want to bring them an answer that they deem sufficient, so that you become a less interesting target for enforcement.
Well, so it sounds like, and I mean, of course, it's a no-brainer. The value of the goods potentially seized is much lower than the value of the damage to the brand reputation from being associated with this. So it's not really a matter of preventing WROs. It's a matter of not being associated with forced labor in many cases.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there do you see consumer pressure as a driver when clients come to you asking for guidance in this matter?
Yeah, well, I think my best story about that is the press release or the press conference that was given by senior DHS officials at the time of the announcement of the cotton WRO against China. And the senior DHS official who gave this press conference basically said, we got the authority to do this, we can do it, we're doing it, and no one's ever challenged us on it. And we really hope that this is, a significant message to consumers, that consumers ought to be driving the conversation with brands, that we expect no forced labor in our goods. And I thought, now that's a really interesting framing from, a U.S. government official, because, in theory, you would think that an enforcement mechanism was not just about torquing companies that find themselves caught in an enforcement mechanism with the lever of danger to your brand, risk to your brand. But that is precisely how it was framed by the U.S. government officials who were announcing it. And that raises a whole host of questions about whether the U.S. government really takes it seriously, like what it's doing. I think the answer to that is that the customs officials who are running this day in and day out, they take it very seriously. But you cannot escape the fact that, at least in some of the early issuance of these, there are political determinations that are being made. And this is very much a part of the broader, more complex political reality that is the landscape of, for example, the US-China trade relationship. It's complex, and people are not afraid to weaponize the reputational association of being affiliated with an allegation of forced labor. people are not afraid to weaponize that. In my view, it's completely the wrong way to think about the law. The law should be the law. It should function in a neutral and an impartial way, and it should be equitable and fair, and there should be a clear pathway to sort of what behavior is expected in order to avoid bad enforcement outcomes. And I think we are moving in that direction, but I don't think we are quite there yet.
In many ways, this becomes a question of brand protection. So, and these are, I promise these are not my questions, but from several people in the audience, basically, where does technology fit in to help solve these problems? When is it necessary? There's a lot of approaches. There's a lot of types of service providers you can adopt, but at which point do you really need technology to mitigate this risk?
Yeah. So the truth is technology can be utilized in a lot of different ways, right? And I would say sort of from my view, the most fundamental is using it to enhance your capacity to track the identity of the family tree, is harkening back to my previous metaphor. That I think is really critical. There are a surprising number of businesses that are still trying to keep tabs on their supply chain with, I heard Luc mention from going back many years, right? Trading spreadsheets back and forth across the globe, keeping tabs on who are we doing business with, and that's just really still very common. And as I said before, the underlying assumption of customs enforcement of 307 is that companies have a level of knowledge or can gain a level of knowledge about their supply chain, about the identity of the actors in their supply chain, and what's going on, what those actors are up to from a labor standpoint. That assumption is just not really borne out in reality a lot of times. So my recommendation to everyone is utilize some technology, find yourself your favorite platform that will help facilitate that. Big fan of that. There's other ways to use technology, right? And there are companies that again, are purporting to utilize sort of forensic testing methodology to establish definitively the country of origin of a given commodity or a given product. I think that those can be useful. They have to be wielded wisely and judiciously. I had a public dialogue with a customs official recently, or a former customs official who described the government's potential utilization of that technology as a, quote, nirvana state. And you can imagine from a customs standpoint why that might be, right? Customs, I mean, if companies don't know their supply chains, many companies don't know the origin of the commodities deep in their supply chains. If companies don't know, customs knows even less than that, right? Customs does not have some magic way of knowing which cotton containing goods coming into the United States contain Xinjiang origin cotton, if that's the prohibited jurisdiction in question. Having a technology that would allow an individual garment to be sampled, sent out for testing, and come back and say, yep, thumbs up, that's Xinjiang origin, and we're statistically confident, that is a potentially powerful tool. It's also a really potentially risky tool for the trade. And if you're a member of the trade, if you're in industry and you're in business and you're interested in utilizing technology like that, there is potential value there, but there's also a lot of risks associated with it. And I think you just need to be super judicious about what you're testing, what types of responses you might get. It's more complex than meets the eye, utilizing that type of testing, and there are definitely considerable risks that need to be managed. But I'm a big fan of technology, and I think that there are also sort of under-approached frontiers when it comes to reducing the forced labor risk itself, utilizing technology, whether it's sort of in managing or overseeing sort of payment mechanisms or abilities to sort of guarantee and ensure sort of who are the actual laborers doing work in fields. Like, there's lots of things that could be utilized to drive insight and add value in a way that would really sing. Those are just a few of them.
That's great. John, I couldn't have asked for more, and I think the audience agrees. Is there any last words you want to pitch your services to our fine audience?
No, I mean, look, the question really just begins with what am I facing? What am I fearful of? And what would I do if this hit tomorrow when we had a shipment detained? What would we produce? What would we explain? How would that resonate with customs? I think that's just a question that every company needs to be asking themselves at this point. And yeah, and I'm happy to send, if anyone's interested in those trade stats, feel free to shoot me a note, and I'm happy to circulate sort of the numbers and the the background on it.
Sounds great. John Foote, Kelley Drye, thanks for all of your expertise and all your wise words.
Thanks, Leo.
Everyone.
Thanks for having me.